When my students ask me which of the great books that we read during the semester is your favorite, I have a tendency to respond that that question is like asking me which of my children do I love the most. We have read some extraordinarily important and engaging works throughout the semester. But I've titled this unit, The Gateway to Civilization, The Challenge of Virgil, quite deliberately. This is a unit that is going to take us to the very heart of classical civilization and is going to hold a mirror up to this if we read and study attentively that will cause us to ask some very, very important questions about our own values. And in this regard, it really is the consummation of the work that we have done this semester. I urge you to read Virgil attentively and carefully. The poet wrote this at an average rate, if you think of all the years he spent on it, of about 2 lines per day. Every word is carefully chosen and carefully positioned. If you were to read it in Latin, you will notice that there are a few half lines. The poet died before he could put the final touches on it. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But that should give you an idea of the way he worked to make sure that everything was intentional and well thought out. This is a masterwork, and we are very fortunate to have it and to have the experience of delving into it. It will inspire us as it has inspired people throughout the centuries. I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the outset orienting us both in place and time. We're making the shift, of course, now from the world of ancient Greece to the world of ancient Rome, and I want to make sure everybody's got a good orientation. This map shows you what the Roman Empire was like at its greatest extent, which is the year 117 of the Common Era. This is very close to what the Roman world would have looked like during the time of Augustus Caesar and Virgil, who, of course, lived during the reign of Augustus. As you've often heard me say throughout the semester, alas, we don't have time. We don't have time to do any kind of reasonable overview of Roman history, and again, I say with regret, we had to do a kind of a whirlwind on the history of Greece in order to concentrate on the literary masterpieces. But I'm going to give you a very quick overview here. The legendary founding of Rome was by Romulus and Remus in the year 753 BCE. There are archaeological remains that let us know that there were settlements on the Palatine Hill of Rome quite early. The legendary history is, of course, just that, legendary, with a certain mix of folk memory and imagination. Rome was ruled by kings in its early era, the 7 kings of Rome, along with the 7 hills of Rome. And in the year 509 BCE, the last king, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus, was overthrown, and the Roman Republic began. And here I particularly regret having to make that leap, because in this period of the early Republic we have Publius, whose name inspired our own Federalist Papers. We have some extraordinary figures that had so much resonance in the history of our nation. Cincinnatus, to whom George Washington was occasionally compared. And before them, Brutus the Liberator, who overthrew Tarquinius Superbus. But we're going to have to leave all of that for another class. If you have the opportunity to study Roman history, please go for it. It's extraordinarily illuminating, both for the history of Western civilization and indeed for a history that had such a profound influence on America's founding fathers. So we're going to jump to the moment when Rome and Greece really collide. After After the conquest of the Greek city-states by Alexander the Great, it was Macedonia that was the ruling power in that region. And the Macedonians were causing more and more trouble for the Romans, so the Romans did what they typically did in such instances. They went to war, and at the Battle of Pydna, they defeated Macedon. And Rome began to rather micromanage Greece at this point, and the Greeks, who really always had a deep-seated instinct for the independence of their city-states, resented it, and in perhaps one of the most mindless and foolish rebellions ever, they went to war against Rome, the Achaean League. And very quickly the Roman army put an end to that. The same year in which they would later defeat Carthage in the Third Punic War, they brutally repressed the rebellion in Greece. And to make an example that would deter other rebellions, Mummius, the general, we used to joke, Mummius all wrapped up in his work, bad joke, but at any rate, Mummius sacked the city of Corinth, killed just about every man in the city, sold the women and children to slavery, and looted the city. A really awful moment in the history of the world, this great, opulent, and cultivated city very much put to the sword and sacked. And that was rather the end of Greek independence. Greece, Achaia, becomes a province. It will later become a senatorial province rather than a militarily garrisoned province. But for all intents and purposes now, Greece is completely subjugated by the Romans. Not long after that, we find internal forces within the Roman Republic pulling it apart. Again, a fascinating history that rather comes to a head starting in the year 133 BCE with the Gracchi pushing for certain reforms that might well have kept the Roman Republic together. That's another topic we won't have a chance to go into. But as we move into the 1st century BCE, we find military figures, generals who use their command and also their administration of the provinces to amass vast fortunes for themselves, which ultimately they begin to use to create client armies loyal to them rather than to Rome. And finally, in the year 49 BCE, in a pivotal moment in Western civilization, pivotal moment in Roman history, Julius Caesar, an extraordinarily successful general, the general who had sacked Gaul, grew vastly wealthy in the process, of course, leads an army loyal to him across the Rubicon, which is the boundary beyond which a general is supposed to lay down his command, and launches the Roman Civil War. So, as Caesar is reputed to have said, the die is cast, and the Roman Civil War commences. Caesar wins this civil war and reigns ultimately as dictator perpetuus, dictator perpetually. This was such an affront to the Roman Senate that ultimately he fell to the knives of senatorial assassins. Actually, ironically, at a meeting held in the theater of Pompey in Rome, Pompey, the general leading the senatorial army that Caesar had defeated. And on the Ides of March, so vividly described in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, he falls to the knives of the assassins. This was almost inevitably going to be a prompt for civil war, the renewal of the Civil War. Julius Caesar had adopted a promising young man, not very well known at the time, named Octavianus. His closest ally, the general on which he himself had depended so heavily, Mark Antony, was the person with the greatest level of authority in Rome, and is really quite puzzled when this youth appears who has been named by Julius Caesar as his heir. That young man, Octavianus, will ultimately be known as Augustus Caesar, a brilliant and one should also say ruthless figure who was able to amass power quickly. They form what is called the Second Triumvirate: Antony, Octavianus, and Lepidus. And they set about one of the uglier moments in this triumvirate, this sharing of power three ways, is the publishing of proscription lists, lists of names of people whose heads can be turned in for a bounty. Among the victims was, of course, the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. This was a particularly ugly era, and one of the reasons I'm dwelling on it is one has to understand that it's during this time that the poet Virgil is coming into adulthood and polishing his powers as a poet. Well, inevitably, the two leading figures, Mark Antony and Octavianus, would come to blows, and in the renewal of that civil war, Octavian is victorious, relying on his great gifted general Agrippa. He defeats Mark Antony finally in the naval battle of Actium, where Mark Antony, who is allied himself with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, fall to his superior naval forces in the year 31 BCE. Octavian is busy with a mopping up operation and returns to Rome. In the year 29, he returns to Rome to celebrate a triple triumph, but unlike his adoptive father, Julius, he does not make the mistake of acting in a way that violates Roman sensibilities by suggesting that he is going to be the sole ruler. And in an absolute masterstroke, in 27 BCE, he walks into the Senate House. He's been holding magistrates' offices, as would be legitimate under Roman constitutional law, and surrenders all of his extraordinary powers. And one can only imagine that the setup was carefully choreographed, and the Senate says, "No, you cannot do that. We need you so desperately." And they give him a new name. He had never liked the idea of being Octavian because it suggested his rather modest origins. And Cicero had mocked him at one point as puer Octavianus, the boy Octavian. And he never would use actually Octavian. He would use Octavius. But now that was over. They give him this extraordinary new name, Augustus, the one who magnifies and increases. And the etymology suggests also auctoritas, authority. He doesn't rule by power. He rules by his authority. And so the Principate of Augustus begins. The Roman world is peaceful in a way that it hasn't been before. As the Roman poet Horace wrote, with Caesar in charge of the land, I don't fear dying anymore, that I don't fear the highwaymen and the civil discord. The great Pax Augustiana, the Augustan peace, has now occurred. Well, we're going to fast forward now to over the Julio-Claudian emperors and all of their successors, and we're going to come to the moment when Constantine proclaims the Edict of Milan in 313 of the Common Era, which granted religious freedom, especially making Christianity, which had been persecuted by the Romans, a legal religion. And not long after that, in the Edicts of Thessalonica, in the year 384, Christianity is made the only legal religion of the empire. Pardon me, I misspoke. 380, the Edict of Thessalonica, when Nicene Christianity is the official state religion of the Roman Empire. And the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, continues for quite some time afterwards. So ironically named Romulus Augustus is overthrown in the year 476 of the Common Era. And then centuries later, Byzantium, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, is overthrown and sacked in the year 1453. So that's your whirlwind tour of Roman history. And now we're going to focus our attention on Virgil's Aeneid. Spoiler alert, I am about to read you the very end of the Aeneid. I have a particular reason for doing this, which will become clear in a moment. You are, by the way, in this presentation going to get an overview of the Aeneid. Much as I've discouraged you from using Spark Notes, this will be much better than anything you can get in Spark Notes. I want you to get a sense of the whole as you're reading it, so the individual units of the next couple of weeks will become very clear. So we come to the very end, Book 12 of the Aeneid, and you have here on the slide the translation by Robert Fagles, a fine poet, fine translator. I'm going to read you now the translation that you are using in this class, that by C.D. Lewis, another very great poet. Aeneas stood over him, poised on the edge of the stroke, but his eyes were restless. He did not strike, and now what Turnus had said was taking effect, was making him more and more indecisive. And then we're going to skip a little bit. We're going to come back to this part. And it continues. Aeneas fastened his eyes on this relic, this sad reminder of all the pain Pallas's death had caused him. Rage shook him. He looked frightening. He said, "Do you hope to get off now, wearing the spoils you took from my Pallas? It's Pallas who strikes this blow, the victim shedding his murderer's blood in retribution." So saying, Aeneas angrily plunged his sword full into Turnus's breast. The body went limp and cold. With a deep sigh, the unconsenting spirit fled to the shades below. Now I want to look with you at what happens immediately before the passage that we just looked at when Aeneas kills his enemy Turnus. Turnus has been wounded by Aeneas, and let me again read you the translation from C.D. Lewis. You can look at this one on the slide that was done by Robert Fagles. Turnus, brought low, stretched out a pleading hand, looked up at his foe in appeal. "I know, I've deserved it. I'll not beg life. Yours was the luck. Make the most of it. But if the thoughts of a father's unhappiness can move you, a father such as you had in Anchises, I ask you, show compassion for aged Daunus, and give me back to him, or if that is the way it must be, give back my dead body. You've won. The Italians have seen me, beaten, these hands outstretched. Lavinia, that was his fiancée, is yours to wed. Don't carry hatred further. Ulteri us ne tend odiis." Well, let's explore why this ending to the Aeneid is such a problematic ending, one that's going to challenge us to our very core. I pause to note that the manuscript tradition of Virgil's Aeneid, as I've mentioned frequently throughout the term, there was no Penguin paperback or Amazon delivery service back then. Texts had to be copied laboriously by hand. And in this beautiful 15th century edition, we not only have exquisitely written lines, but we also have illustrations. And here you see that the end of the Aeneid little miniature in which Aeneas is killing his enemy Turnus. I just want to pause for a moment on this moment of supplication. This is a scene from the Trojan War. Here it's Achilles killing the Amazon queen Penthesilea. The pathos of this moment is one that has never escaped artists, whether they be poets or painters. This has nothing to do with the Aeneid per se, but I did want you to focus a little bit on what that means when a fallen, wounded enemy begs for mercy. Just for fun, I wrote a new ending to the Aeneid. In Latin, atque heros Romanos amica fronte benigne, porexit dextram rutulo, fermansque percantem lit latio gaudens imponere pacem. Or in English, and the Roman hero, with kindness in the gaze of friendship, stretched out his hand to the Rutulian and lifted him up, reassuring him in his supplication and rejoicing to bestow peace upon Latium. I will leave you to decide which ending is the better and more meaningful ending of the Aeneid. With Virgil, we have a classic in his own day. Here a mosaic from northern Africa, and this is the 3rd century of the Common Era, so really maybe a couple hundred years, a little more, after the death of Virgil. A classic immediately in Roman culture. The manuscript tradition for Virgil is the richest of any Latin author. This is a manuscript in the Vatican Library, 5th century of the Common Era. And you see, once again, it's beautifully written. Parchment's very expensive, and it was not used frivolously in the ancient or the medieval world. And once again, well illustrated with this little miniature, which we see on other pages of this manuscript. And getting back to the classic in its own day theme, Virgil read a section of the Aeneid to Augustus, and here he's reading about the death of Marcellus, this young man that Augustus found so promising and wanted to be his successor. And there, Marcellus's mother, Octavia, is fainting away as she hears the poet read his lines. This in a painting by Angelica Kaufmann, probably done in the 18th century, and it illustrates the impact that this story has had throughout the centuries. A 19th century painting by Ingres, which shows again the same scene. There's Augustus propping up his sister Octavia, who has fainted away. And the classic status of this poem continued and intensified in the centuries that followed. When Dante takes his tour of the Inferno, of the underworld, otherwise known as Hell, who guides him but the poet Virgil, who takes him all the way through the Inferno, through Hell, and through Purgatory, but cannot, of course, enter paradise because he was not a Christian. But look at those words that Dante uses to embrace the memory of Virgil as his inspiration. Now art thou that Virgilius, and that fountain which spread abroad so wide a river of speech. I made response to him with a bashful forehead. Oh, of the other poets' honor and light, avail me the long study and great love that have impelled me to explore thy volume. Thou art my master and my author, thou. Thou art alone the one from whom I took the beautiful style that has done honor to me. As late as the 15th century of our era, there was a mass sung at Mantua, the birthplace of Virgil, the Mass of St. Paul, in which the apostle it is recounted to have visited the tomb of Virgil. There's some beautiful medieval lines that record that as St. Paul wept, he said, ad maronis mausoleum ductus fudit super eam piae rorum lacrimae, quem te inquit redidissim, si te vivum invenissim poetarim maxime. Led to the tomb of Maro, that's Virgil. He poured over him a dew of pious tears, and he said, what a person I would have recreated if I had found you alive, O greatest of poets. Let's now look a little bit at the historical context of Virgil, how he intersects with that quick Roman history that I had given you earlier. He's born in the year 70 BCE. When he was about 7 years old, Cicero was consul, and Octavian, who would later be Augustus Caesar, is born that same year. And as I mentioned before, in 49, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Virgil at this point is 21 years old, roughly, and thus he's growing to adulthood during the most perilous times in Roman history. Caesar assassinated a few years later. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, when Antony defeats Brutus and Cassius, memorably described in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. The year that Antony marries Cleopatra in that rather fatal wedding, in the ramp-up to the final stages of the Roman Civil War, Virgil publishes his first group of poems, the Eclogues, his 10 pastoral poems. And in 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium between the forces of Augustus and Antony and Cleopatra. Augustus, of course, Octavian at the time, later to become Augustus, wins that battle. In 29 BCE, Virgil publishes the Georgics, a poem nominally about farming, but much more about the life and times in the late Republic, where he does indeed write explicitly about Octavius, soon to become Augustus Caesar. And in 27 BCE, of course, Octavian does become Augustus Caesar. In 19 BCE, Virgil dies in the port city of Brundisium. But of course, by that point, as I'd mentioned earlier, he's well known to Augustus Caesar, and indeed had even read parts of the Aeneid, which he was drafting to the emperor. Virgil is laying a challenge to Homer. This is a pretty extraordinary thing to do, rather cheeky, especially after the work of the Alexandrian poets like Callimachus, who regarded Homer as the indisputable master and had nothing but scorn for those who tried to imitate him in any way. So Virgil is treading on some rather remarkable, bold territory. And you see it in the very first line of the Aeneid, I sing of arms and the man. Arms, of course, being the 24 books of the Iliad, and the man being the Odyssey, again in 24 books. And what does Virgil do? First, we start with the man. The Aeneid, books 1 through 6, tells of the wandering of the Trojans throughout the Mediterranean world to find the home given to them in prophecy, which is going to be in Italy. And then The war books, the Iliad, will be 7 through 12 as the Trojans defeat the Italians. And even along the way, we will see a cameo appearance of Diomedes, the ferocious Greek who had fought against the Trojans, who's now lodged in Italy as well. And now a whirlwind tour of the Aeneid so that you'll be able to see the structure as you read the parts. And do not think that this is a substitute for reading the Aeneid, which I hope you will cherish in the coming weeks, and that you will keep that book and reread it throughout your lives. It is, as I'm going to try to demonstrate as clearly as possible, a gateway to civilization. So how does Aeneas enter into the picture? With a wail. 3, 4 times blessed my comrades, lucky to die beneath the walls of Troy. This is in some ways a very unlikely hero. This is somebody upon whom destiny has thrust a tremendous burden. He reaches the city of Carthage in North Africa. He meets the widowed queen Dido. Meanwhile, we find in that book Jupiter letting us know his prophecy for Aeneas, his son Iulus, and for Rome. This he's giving to reassure Venus, otherwise known as Aphrodite in Greek mythology, the mother of Aeneas. Imperium sine fine dedi, I have granted dominion without boundary, thus the Roman vision. And inside the temple, furor impious, godless fury, raging, will be bound and controlled. So what we're getting here at the very start of this is that this story of the wandering Trojan is going to be the story of Rome. It will be the national epic for Rome with a vision of the Augustan peace. And at the end of that book, we have the fated and illicit liaison of Dido, the queen of Carthage, and Aeneas, which will come back to us in the 4th book in the famous story of Dido and Aeneas. In book 2, poor Dido, already infatuated with the handsome Aeneas, asks him to tell his story about the fall of Troy. And we learn that Aeneas wanted to die. He wanted to die fighting. He dresses in Greek armor in order to slaughter some Greeks along the way. But when he witnesses the death of Priam, he resolves to go back to his house and rescue his father. Along the way, he sees Helen. This may not even be authentically Virgil. There's some quarrel about whether, among scholars, about whether this was what's called an interpolation. But read it for yourselves and decide. His father, Anchises, refuses to leave Troy, and Aeneas rushes again to battle. One of the great Virgilian commentators of the last century said, Aeneas learns that the responsibilities which he bears go beyond the satisfaction of his personal honor. Warned by the gods, he returns to his house. He sees a portent from his son Iulus, and the family flees, Aeneas carrying his elderly father, who carries in his arms the household gods. His wife Creusa is lost. He makes a desperate attempt to go back and find her. It was her ghost that says, get going, it's over. And hence his deep sense of personal loss gives way to his destiny and the sweep of the history to come. And in this magnificent statue by Bernini, we see that moment, pivotal moment in Roman history and Roman ideology. The pious son, he is Pius Aeneas, carrying his aged father, his father carrying the images of the household god, his little son Ascanius holding the sacred fire from his hearth that'll be taken with them to their new home, ultimately clinging to him. This is Romanitas, Romanness in its quintessence. Book 3 is a story of wandering, one oracle after another not understood. Aeneas has no clear idea where he's going. He knows he has a destiny, but it is not clear. He visits, this is a remarkable little cameo, a kind of miniature Troy, where another one of his comrades has found a safe home. There he meets Hector's widow, Andromache, who laments for her murdered child, Astyanax, which of course you'll remember from our study of the Iliad and our viewing of the Trojan women. But this little miniature Troy is not where he can find his home. He's not going to be given anything so simple. And along the way, a very remarkable thing happens. He finds a companion of Odysseus, in Roman usage, Ulysses, and rescues him from the Cyclops island. Now, hearken this. Aeneas, who has just fought for his life against the Greeks who sacked his city, has the compassion to rescue a Greek. Think about this as we move towards the Iliadic books of the Aeneid. Who is this hero who can so quickly be moved to compassion and save a Greek? And another terrible loss, Anchises, whom Aeneas had rescued from Troy, dies in the third book. And in the fourth, we learn of the scheming of the gods to bring Aeneas and Dido together. She already desperately in love with him. That had been arranged by Venus already. And now they are, by design, brought together in a cave, and they consider that they are now a couple. For Dido, this is, of course, very dangerous. She's been seen as kind of like Queen Elizabeth, the unmarried queen of her city. And now there is this rather fancy pants Trojan in his fancy Trojan clothes, who has become her lover and consort. And Aeneas is now happy to act like a Carthaginian. He's helping her build the city. Jupiter sends Mercury, otherwise known as Hermes in Greek mythology, to taunt him, say, "What do you think you're doing?" and warn him to resume his mission. Aeneas is horror-struck. He doesn't want to be cruel in the way he breaks the news. Dido is, as one would imagine, for a woman who's given up everything for him, invokes what she considers their marriage, and she wishes poignantly that she'd been with child from him. And as one of the great Virgil commentators said, to an appeal which would move a stone, Aeneas replies with the cold and formal rhetoric of an attorney. In other words, he has been reminded of his destiny. Nothing will stand in the way, neither her pleas nor the promptings of his own heart. As he says to her, Italiam non sponte sequor, I'm not going to Italy because I want to. This has been thrust upon him. He wanted to die in Troy. That was not to be allowed. He wants to stay in Carthage with this woman that he adores. That's not going to happen either. There is a tragedy of Dido, and there's also a tragedy of Aeneas. Another great theme in literature and music to follow. Henry Purcell in the 17th century wrote a opera called Dido and Aeneas, and Aeneas utters these lines that are just so out of character. Aeneas has no fate but you. Let Dido smile and I'll defy the feeble stroke of destiny. Well, that didn't work in the Aeneid, and it doesn't work in this opera either. The rich illustrated manuscript, this is the Vaticanus, another one of the manuscripts of Virgil in the Vatican Library, shows Aeneas and his crew departing from Carthage, the desperate Dido looking out from her house. Again, from the richly illustrated Vaticanus manuscript, spoiler alert, Dido committing suicide in grief as Aeneas leaves. And another scene of Dido's end. Aeneas can give no comfort, as we saw. Mercury comes down a second time and says, "Get going, hurry up." And Dido lays a curse upon the Romans. Remember, this is Carthage. Rome will one day fight 3 wars against Carthage. The second one in particular being one of deadly possibility when Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, comes with his army into Italy itself, very close to the walls of Rome. Dido dies with great dignity. She regains her stature, and she recounts what she did. Her lines have the cadence of what a Roman general might put on his tombstone. The suicide is painful. She lingers for a while. Virgil does not spare us the tragedy of this broken love story. Virgil's national epic is indeed that. It is an epic, deeply patriotic, celebrating Rome, but it never lets us off so easy that we can ignore the emotional and the personal cost, the erosion in many ways of that most sensitive and beautiful part of Aeneas. And there's even a little obtuseness that Aeneas displays in Book 5 as they sail away. Can't quite figure out what those fires are, why there would be anything wrong in Carthage. Aeneas is, of course, grief-stricken at having to leave, but once the command comes from divinity, he is the tool of destiny. The personal world is one that he simply has to abandon. Book 5, we have some really quite engaging funeral games for Anchises. We won't have time to go into those now. The Trojan women really want to stay where they are. They're not interested in continuing their voyage, looking for the place of destiny. And they burn the ships, but Neptune does help them finally to reach Italy, leaving Sicily and making their way to Italy. You need to read Book 6 with exceptional care. Some of the most pivotal and important moments that will condition the rest of the Aeneid are there. In this book, Aeneas descends to the underworld, remember, much like Odysseus had done, led by the Sibyl, this prophetess of Apollo. And she does give a grim prophecy, bella, horrida bella, war, awful war, another Achilles. But, this is the destiny that he is going to pursue. So in the underworld, he meets the ghost of Dido and asks arguably the stupidest question that any man could ask of a woman whom he had left in desperate circumstances. Did I cause this? And I don't mean to be flippant. What Virgil is doing here is showing once again the terrible personal cost of what it meant to be the tool of destiny. She, in her dignity, will not look at him. He, pouring out tears, laments all that has happened. Dido, of course, had been married before. She was the widow of Zacchaeus, and he comforts her in the underworld. St. Augustine once wrote that he wept tears for Dido when he should have been weeping for his own sins. It's hard not to read the story of Dido and Aeneas with anything less than grief. So in the underworld, he sees the torment of the wicked, he sees the abode of the blessed in the Elysian fields, and most important, he meets his father Anchises, the ghost of his father Anchises, and he sees the catalogue of Roman heroes to come, including Augustus. And arguably the most important lines in the Aeneid, when the ghost of Anchises tells his son what the destiny is. Tu reger imperio populos Romane memento, hae tiberunt artes paciquim ponere morem, parcere subjectis, et debilare superbos. I'm going to read you the whole passage in translation from C.D. Lewis, giving you the context. What does it mean to be a Roman? Let others fashion from bronze more lifelike, breathing images, for so they shall, and evoke living faces from marble. Others excel as orators, others track with their instruments the planets circling in heaven and predict when stars will appear. And now those lines that I gave you here in Latin. But Romans, never forget that government is your medium. Be this your art, to practice men in the habit of peace, generosity to the conquered, and firmness against aggressors. I'm going to pause on those lines a little bit more. Anchises doesn't say, my son. He doesn't say Aeneas. He says, Romane, Roman, already looking forward to what the destiny of his son will be. Remember, these will be your arts. Let the Greeks be great at sculpture. Let them be better orators. Let them be better scientists. Your arts are the arts of government, to spread peace throughout the world. And now I want you to think back to the very end of the Aeneid. Parcere subjectis et debilare superbos. Spare the fallen and disarm the arrogant. Does Aeneas live up to the words of his father? Hold that thought. I realize I've been holding you a little longer than I usually do in these presentations, but let's continue. Book 7, the Roman Iliad, begins. Italy's had a golden age, no need of law, everybody's living well together, and suddenly these Trojans arrive. Well, Lavinia has been betrothed to a fine young prince named Turnus, but the destiny is that he's supposed to marry her. And note the name, the region is called Lavinium, so ultimately Aeneas will marry his work by marrying the woman called Lavinia. That's not by accident. Well, Juno, who's always loathed the Trojans, that's Hera in Greek mythology, you remember from the Iliad, wants to stir up war. She doesn't want this to be easy for these hated Trojans that are now in Italy. The Trojans are a bit outnumbered here, and remarkably, where does help come from? It comes from a Greek. The old lines of foe and friend have dissolved. If they hadn't already in that interesting episode in Book 3 when Aeneas rescues the Greek from the Cyclops Island, here the former foes are becoming now the friends. And Evander is celebrating a cult of Heracles. Heracles, of course, a very important figure, as the Romans called him, Hercules, for clearing the world of monsters. And he takes him for a tour of what will one day be Rome. Virgil is giving us an idea of what the Roman Forum will one day be like. Aeneas, the Trojan, has to become an Italian. If he's going to be ultimately the originator of the line of the Romans, he can no longer be the foreign prince dressed in his fancy clothes. And we come to a very important moment here in the 8th book when Evander basically takes him to the guest quarters. And he says to him, "Hercules stooped to enter this door. This humble palace received the conquering hero. Have the courage, my guest, to despise possessions. Train yourself as he, to be worthy of Godhead. Don't be intolerant of poverty." Evander, with these words, led tall Aeneas beneath the roof of his simple dwelling, and gave him a couch of leaves with a coverlet made from the skin of a Libyan bear to sleep in. Night came on, enfolding the earth in her dusky wings. The great hero who had slept in a palace in Troy will now sleep on the ground, taking upon himself the habits of a leader who can scorn wealth and luxury in order to be able to achieve the destiny upon him. And while he slumbers, his mother goes to Vulcan and begs for a shield for her son for the forthcoming battle. And it's a brilliant ekphrasis, a cameo within the book, showing scenes of Roman history, with the climax being the Battle of Actium and Augustus. There is certainly some imperial propaganda going on here as Virgil praises Augustus, praises him clearly with a great amount of sincerity. He had seen the ravages of the Civil War, but never think that in Virgil's praise there's not also warning. This is, of course, the celebration of the Battle of Actium, and it's pretty extraordinary as we see the forces of the Romans are lined up against Antony and Cleopatra. On one side, Augustus Caesar, high up on the poop deck, is leading the Italians into battle, the Senate and the people with him, his home gods and the great gods. 2 flames shoot from his helmet in jubilant light, and his father's star dawns over the crest. Elsewhere in the scene is Agrippa. The gods and the winds fight for him, prominent leading his column, the naval crown with its miniature ship's beaks, a proud decoration of war, shines on his head. And then some rather ignoble propaganda about the forces that Antony led. On the other side, with barbaric wealth and motley equipment, is Antony, fresh from his triumphs in the east by the shores of the Indian Ocean. Egypt, the powers of the Orient, and uttermost Bactria sail with him. And a shameful thing, Aegyptia conjunx, his Egyptian wife. Well, let me pause about that. Cleopatra is a Greek name, the one of distinguished lineage. She's a Ptolemy. She's as Greek as you can get. But for this kind of jingoistic imperial propaganda, which was very much in the air during the Roman Civil War, it's Rome versus the forces of Egypt. And that's what Virgil does give us here. And here for you is the translation of Robert Fagel's of that passage that I just read you in C.D. Lewis's translation. Racing on here, I don't mean to ignore books 9 and 11, but I realize I have held you a little longer than usual with one of these presentations. Book 10 is extremely important because it gives us a sense of Aeneas in battle after he has been enraged by the death of the son of Evander, his comrade Pallas. And I note one detail, that as Aeneas sails back along the Tiber, the language is very much similar to the way Augustus had been described. Now, is this complimenting Augustus, linking him to Aeneas? Yes. But also, when we see the way Aeneas behaves, there is, in my mind, a certain word of warning. Turnus has slain Pallas, and Aeneas is in a hot rage. Next in his anger, he tried a long spear shot at Magus, who ducked adroitly so that the vibrant projectile flew over him. Then, clutching the knees of the Trojan, babbled out prayers for mercy. By the shade of your sire, Parker subjectis, by the shade of Anchises, and all your hopes for Ascanius' future, that's his son. So I beg you by your father, who had told you to spare the fallen, and by your son, I implore you, don't kill me. Preserve me for my son's sake and my father's. And then he promises all kinds of gold. Aeneas gave him his answer thus: those many talents of silver and gold you tell me about, keep them for your children. Such courteous bargains in war Turnus was the first to abjure just now when he killed Pallas. That's what my father Anchises thinks, and my son Ascanius. So saying, Aeneas gripped the man's helmet in his left hand, bent his head back while he pleaded, and drove the sword home in his throat. Who, I ask you, did we see behaving this way in the Iliad? It was Achilles. Who is the new Greek warrior now? It's the Trojan Aeneas. Notice the way Virgil has shifted the dynamic, making us question who are the heroes and whose values have been corrupted. And here you have those texts that I had just spoken of. In the 12th book, Aeneas is wounded. There's his solicitous mother, Venus, and his son, Ascanius, weeping as the arrow is cut out from his thigh so he can return to battle. Look with me at the poignant words that Aeneas speaks to his son in Book 12. This, by the way, is the only time in the whole of the epic that he speaks to this son that he had rescued from Troy, whom he loves more than almost anything else in the world, besides, one might say, his destiny. Learn courage from me, my son, true hardship too. Learn good luck from others. My hand will shield you in war today and guide you toward the great rewards. But mark my words, soon you will ripen into manhood, reaching back for the models of your kin. Remember Father Aeneas and Uncle Hector. Fire your heart. Well, two of the most unhappy people in history. Aeneas, who's lost Creusa, lost Dido, lost his friend Pallas, and Hector, of course, slain by Achilles before the walls of Troy. So we come back to that point when I began looking at the Aeneid with you, with my spoiler, giving you the last few lines, and here they are again, juxtaposed to the lines from Book 6 when Aeneas' father Anchises tells him, spare the fallen and disarm the arrogant. And also some lines in Book 1 which have a terrible irony. The vision, the prophecy for all the great things that are going to happen in Rome. Asperatum positis mitescent saecula bellis cana fides et vesta, remo cum fratra querinus jura dabunt. I told you about the binding of furor impius, godless fury, inside the temple, so that he could not escape. He could sit there bristling with rage, with his bloody mouth, but his hands were tied behind his back. Yet right before that, this is so Virgilian, Quirinus, that's another name for Romulus, will give laws with his brother Remus. That's a lie, and every Roman would have known it. Romulus killed Remus. It was the archetype of Roman civil war. These lines are dripping with irony. Hear Virgil's warning to us. Don't get smug. Don't think that you have established peace for all times. Don't think that for all of your goodness you can escape the fires of passion and the danger of rage. My teacher, Oliver Line, from whom I learned so very much, now sadly no longer with us, said this better than anybody else. If Aeneas, the son of a goddess, the hero of the epic, cannot succeed, then perhaps no one can. With great realism, Virgil shows how an Aeneas who is genuinely in sympathy with Stoic imperial ideals of the appropriate methods of warfare cannot, under the relentless pressure of human reality, always uphold them. So that, my students and friends, is Virgil's great warning to us. In the Georgics, he has an image of a person rowing a boat against the stream. The moment he stops, he'll be swept back by the current. And that is the moral warning of the Aeneid. When I look at the lines of our national anthem, the third stanza, which unfortunately doesn't get sung nearly as much as it should, think of what Francis Scott Key is really saying. Thus be it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Now listen. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. I personally believe in those words and recognize that there are times when a just nation will go to war for just reasons. But Virgil's warning to us is that inside of us is the capacity to abandon all of the things that we most prize when we let loose furor impius, godless rage. How easy it is to forget those principles that allow us to think and allow us to cherish the notions that we are going to live better and we are going to make a better world. Remember, I think I showed you what C.S. Lewis had said about the Aeneid. You cannot be young twice. You cannot read this epic and think about it and be the same person. What I hope is, as we come close to the end of the semester, that you will have thought deeply about what the values are that we can bring to ourselves from studying the past. And in Virgil, we find the quintessence of all of that.